All right, we're back. Tube's Code content, and today we are going to be focusing on open source software. We have been reading Wikinomics by Don Tapscott and Anthony Williams, and in their book they focus a lot of their time on open source software itself as an example of how people are collaborating across boundaries outside of organizations, etc. So I want to go through it and give you some examples of what's going on out there in the open source world and explain some of the ethos and the philosophy behind it and give examples. So open source software, it's a philosophy. There is a whole legal framework around it. There's a methodology for creating it. There's a culture behind it. And again, as I said, I want to give examples of some of the stuff that is going on there. And to start off with the philosophy of open source software, it's that open source provides a liberty and a freedom that is not available in typical proprietary software that we might be familiar with, such as a Microsoft Word or other kind of desktop applications that we've come across. It provides a freedom, and the freedom that open source proponents discuss is that it's free as in speech and not as in beer. That is, that open source can be paid software. An example of that is an e-commerce software platform called Magento, which provides a open source package that you can download for free. It's the community edition, but they also have an open source edition that runs for about $8,000 or $9,000, $10,000 is the enterprise edition, and basically if you purchase that, you have access to the code in the software package, but they give you a bunch of add-ons and support features that values the package in that kind of $8,000 to $10,000 range. Proponents of the open source software movement say that software should not have owners. This is, could be construed as kind of a very radical notion, but the idea is that software is such an important part of where we are at the beginning of the 21st century that one should be able to access the software, manipulate the software, change the software, do whatever they want with the software, pass it on to their neighbors if they think that software would be advantageous to them. And this is a radical departure from what we've generally grown up with in the past 20 years or so, past generation of proprietary software that we buy off the shelf in a package, and there's a whole slew of copyright around it that prevents us from sharing it, and if we do share it, we will be accused of piracy, and owners of proprietary software have worked within legal frameworks around the world in order to prevent the distribution, the unauthorized distribution of that software. So in a nutshell, the definition of open source, and this little guy on the right-hand side of your screen is the logo for the GNU Foundation, which is kind of the original open source foundation. So it's not just a random animal that's up there, but the definition that the GNU Foundation gives is that open source provides the freedom to run any program for any purpose, and that part of that freedom allows us to get into the actual code, see how that code works, see what that code is doing, and we can modify that code however we wish and whenever we wish. And then on top of that, we can distribute that code to whoever we want, whenever we want, and if we have made modifications and such, we are kind of bound by the ethos and the law, the copyright that actually governs open source software, to commit that back to the community and let other people access that software and pass it on themselves. So while it sounds like a very radical idea, open source is something that major companies and corporations have also embraced. Not as necessarily the primary source of their business, although some publicly traded companies do deal specifically in the open source world. But I've mentioned the GNU Foundation, and they have the GNU General Public License, which a lot of open source software is actually licensed under. You see that MIT is involved. There's an MIT license that you can, if you're creating open source software, you can license your creation under the MIT license. So that's a foundation. To academic institute, the Mozilla Public License that brings you Firefox, so again another foundation, and then NASA has an open source agreement, and so that's a governmental organization, and that's very important. But I think these final three are also important because it demonstrates that very large corporations, global corporations, publicly traded corporations, understand the importance of what open source is as well. And so you have Nokia, cell phone maker. They provide an open source license. Microsoft, which historically has been thought of as kind of the enemy of open source, they have a public license. And IBM also has a public license. And in Wikinomics, they spend a lot of time talking about IBM's work within the Linux development community. And so these are just a snapshot of a few of the licenses available. There are many more that are out there, but all kind of providing these legal frameworks within which open source can actually work. Now, GNU has a very interesting preamble to their actual license. If you've read contracts and whatnot and service level agreements, they're usually very boring reads, but this is very interesting. This comes from the preamble of the GNU General Public License. When we speak of free software, we're referring to freedom, not price, and they're saying that their general license makes sure that you have that freedom, as in speech, and that when you receive source code, you can get at it if you want, you can change that software, use programs of it in new free programs, and that the license guarantees these freedoms. And a very important part of how this licensing works is under a concept of copyleft. Now, we're all familiar with copyright, which kind of creates the terms and conditions with which one can recreate and reproduce content, be it a video or an image or an article or a piece of software. Copyleft builds upon that and actually kind of turns it on its head. And so copyleft is a form of copyright, it's a play off of copyright. But what it does, it says this open source software is copyrighted, and that copyright is going to affect all downstream uses of the copyrighted material, so of the software, and it's going to embed open source freedoms in derivatives of the original work. And how that's going to happen is that the copyright within open source is going to say that it's going to grant these freedoms, that anybody can take this if they create derivative work with it and from it. It's still an open source product. And the reason that this was created was something that Richard Stallman, who's basically the godfather of open source software and a leading proponent of it, he understood at the very beginning of his quest to create an open source framework that if you simply left software in the public domain, that would give people the freedom to use it, but within the public domain, within U.S. copyright law, if you create a derivative work of something, you are allowed to then copyright it and control it, and then determine the conditions on which others can then use it. And so he said, okay, just putting software into the public domain will not necessarily work. I need to maintain a copyright on it. And so he called it a copyleft, and he said, okay, if you do make derivative works, then it will still be bound by the original copyright of the original open source product. And that way, it will always be available to the public with the freedoms that are described in the open source movement. So this is basically, summarizes that. So if you go to new.org, they describe the copyleft, and they say, the first state is that it's copyrighted, and then they add distribution terms, which is a legal instrument that gives everybody the right to use, modify, redistribute the program's code or any program derived from it. And then once that happens, the code and the freedoms become legally inseparable. So you can't say, hey, I took some of this open source code, created something new out of it, and now it's closed and proprietary and nobody can have at it. So copyleft is this very kind of clever take on copyright. And again, it turns kind of our traditional notions of a closed copyright and turns it on its head. So the methodology of open source is one of peer production, collaboration, and transparency. And if we look at these things individually, by peer production, it is many people working on the piece of software. They can be geographically dispersed. And the idea behind it, though, is that just as, say, a scientific journal or an academic journal has peer review, proponents of open source generally say that their software will be better, has the capability and ability to be better because it's under constant review by a larger community of people. So there may be very talented group of developers within an organization creating a piece of proprietary software, but that's a finite group of people who are in that organization, and somebody who might best know how to accomplish something might very well be outside of that organization. And so in the open source model, traditionally, it might start off as a project between one person, a couple people, handful of people, and they bring that piece of software to some sort of alpha release, and then they open it up to a larger community to take part in the collaboration and the creation of it. And how that will work is that they will put it out somewhere where people can access it, download it, review it, and start adding different components to it. And that could be anything very small, from a patch that kind of fixes a small bug to a whole new feature set. And the people who get involved might have a variety of abilities. There might be some total ninjas who are working on it. There might be some people who are kind of new to software development, but how it works is basically people, according to their abilities, can take small parts of the entire project and start creating around it and contributing to it. And the process is transparent. The software itself is transparent, and together something new is generated and created. So from the open source initiative, we see that open source, apart from the legal stuff that I've gone through, it's a development method. It's trying to harness the power of distributed peer review and transparency. And the promise is that open source will provide better quality, higher reliability, and better flexibility at a lower cost than a proprietary solution. So that focuses kind of on the open source software side of things. And open source, when it's considered, is mostly considered as a software solution for creating software itself. But the ethos of it and the culture of it has spread through a variety of industries and a variety of disciplines that I think are very important. And so the first one I have up here, it's silly, but it's fun. Over in Europe, there are 3 different beverages that have been created kind of in an open source model. One is Open Cola, the other is Vores Beer, and another beer is Brewtopia. But basically, the creators of these things have put the recipe for the cola or for the beer online for the community to access. Anybody in the community can create their own versions of it. They might submit back like, hey, actually, if you change the recipe this way or that way, you get a better beer, you get a better cola. But if we think about normal soft drink companies, a Coca-Cola or a Pepsi, their formulas and recipes are guarded as state secrets. And so this is a fun way to say, you know what, we all like soda, we all like beer, and a lot of us like to actually make things, and if you're so inclined, here's the recipe for doing stuff, and now bottle it yourself and have at it as you may, and go forth and prosper. So this open source ethos has hit kind of this soda and beer market. More seriously and significant, if we look at the next couple of examples, the Tropical Disease Initiative, Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiative, Institute for One World Health. These are organizations that have gathered scientists either from academia or those from pharmaceutical companies or those who used to work for pharmaceutical companies. And they've brought them together and said, let's collaborate on medicines for disease conditions and whatnot that are generally running below the radar of kind of the high profit margins that pharmaceutical might want to tackle, but are very important to the health of large numbers of people in the world. And so the screenshot on the right is for Drugs for Neglected Disease Initiatives, and basically scientists come together, they share information about how to create new drugs to combat different diseases that could be of radical importance in the developing world. And then anybody can come in and they can say, hey, we're looking for a solution for X, Y, and Z. We are going to take the research information from this site, and we're going to create our own drugs and our own solutions for that. So it takes care of the research and development that costs millions and millions of dollars in order to tackle kind of very important disease conditions. The Science Commons is another one that focuses on this. It's global scientists coming together, sharing information, opening themselves up to peer review, being transparent in what they're studying, what they're focusing on, and working on new solutions for things. Even in government now, over the past kind of 5-10 years, there's been a big push for open source governance, which is basically, hey, in democracies, we as citizens have the right to be able to access the information, the source code of what is going on in the government, whether that is the process of how bills are made, whether that is just the numbers and data that different governmental agencies are gathering. And we as citizens have the right to that information in order to take it and use it as we might best feel it should be used, which could be, a web app that shows how, agricultural data. It could be a web app showing how government funds have been spent, but it's basically to add transparency and sunlight to what has historically been kind of a very opaque governmental process. And again, this is something, the ethos of this is coming from the open source movement. The MIT's Opencourseware Initiative, again, is something very interesting. Opencourseware, if you go to it, provides a lot of lecture notes, audio, podcasts, video streams, etc. of some of the great lectures that are happening at MIT. and they're made freely available for anybody in the world to either access, or equally important for other academic institutions around the world to download and incorporate into their own curricula. And so you can imagine the benefit of that. MIT is one of the world's great academic institutions, and now anybody in the world, any institution in the world, any individual in the world, can take content that has been created by the great faculty at that institution and incorporate it, manipulate it, mash it up, use it however they want in their own curricula. And this is something that MIT has been working on for a number of years. And related to that is the open source curriculum movement, which a lot of technologists have actually been working on and getting behind, as well as educators and academics, saying, you know what, the costs of things like textbooks are very, very expensive. Why don't we create something, a biology textbook that is free and open source. It has, it's been peer reviewed. It has great authors behind it. And again, anybody can come, take it, download it, manipulate it how they need to manipulate it so it fits into their own curriculum. And it's a world-class textbook, and it just doesn't have the $150 price tag that a normal textbook might have. And so you can see the advantages of that in terms of education, both nationally and internationally. And then finally, open source is not just something that is affecting kind of the bits and bytes of the world, stuff that can be digitized, but there's a whole open source hardware movement and do-it-yourself movement, or it's coming out of the do-it-yourself movement. And open source hardware can be anything from little single-person planes, hang gliders, guitars, whatnot. But it's basically a way for basically people who are in the hardware space publish the specs of how you put stuff together, what materials you'll need to put it together, publish the blueprints, and people can go out and they can access this stuff and they can come together and create their own hang glider. And so depending on how much you believe in open source as a philosophy, and you put your hang glider away or together, if you truly believe, you will go jump off that cliff with your new open source hang glider. So point here is that the ethos of open source spreads across a number of disciplines and a number of areas outside of software itself. One organization that I want to focus on that kind of uses this open source ethos in terms of a global activism is Architecture for Humanity. This was started by a guy named Cameron Sinclair about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and he was an architect in New York City. He's English by way of background, but he was in his 20s. He was an architect in New York City, working at the lower rungs of an architectural firm, and he was looking around and he was saying, architects at this point in time, in the late 90s, are being celebrated for building the great new Prada store. They're being celebrated for building, the great new restaurant, for the great new office building, etc., etc. And he said architects have a much larger mission and goal and responsibility to society than making just a beautiful Prada store. Not that there's anything wrong with a beautiful Prada store, but that architects have a unique ability to create things that are of societal value and humanitarian value to the world. And so, examples of that could be transitional housing in a post-conflict society. It could be transitional housing after a natural disaster, et cetera, et cetera. And so what they have done is brought together thousands of designers and architects to create solutions that others can then access in order to quickly create the shelters and housings that might be needed in the event of emergency. And so instead of building something from scratch, they've provided a network, the Open Architecture Network, that lets people come in and say, hey, we need to figure out how to make transitional housing in a snap, and here's a place where we can get it, and here are lots of people who have come together who can help us actually implement it ourselves. So if we come back to the software aspect of things, I want to focus on the LAMP stack. We've discussed LAMP before, and basically it is Linux, which is an operating system, Apache, which is a web serving software, MySQL, which is a database, and PHP, which is a programming language that accesses the database and basically creates your pages on the fly dynamically depending on what you're looking for when you're on a website. So the LAMP stack should not be thought of as like the only thing that's out there. There's a lot of other programming languages besides PHP, things like Ruby on Rails, Python, etc., etc. There are other databases out there, but just the LAMP stack is kind of as sort of a very established open source framework upon which we can create new applications is out there and it's mature. So I've put dates next to each one of these things, approximate dates about when they kind of were publicly released into the world. And so you see that Linux was created by Linus Torvalds, and he released it in 1994. So over the past 16 years, other people have worked on it. In Wikinomics, we discuss, or Tapscott and Williams discuss, how IBM has put a number of their own developers behind it in order to build it out and create it into a mature, robust operating system for web servers. But Linux doesn't exist just on web servers. It's in our cell phones now. Many people use it actually as their desktop operating system. It's on other portable devices. It's in our cars, etc., etc. And so, I just put these things up here to demonstrate that this isn't some sort of new fad. It's been around for a while. 15, 20 years in software and internet life is generations. And this has been something that has taken hold, and people are building on top of it a lot of exceptional software solutions. And so one of them that I want to focus on, since we are media creators, is basically the content management systems that we might come across in our future organizations, or have in our current organizations, or considering in our current organizations. We looked at WordPress a couple weeks ago, because that is what we're using for Tubes Code content. And so I'm not going to focus on that. But what we have up here is Drupal, we have Expression Engine, we have Joomla, and we have Plone. And these are four other very good open source content management systems that you might choose to use depending on kind of the project that you have and what you need to actually accomplish. Most content management systems, open source content management systems, for the type of organizations that we're working in, will accomplish probably 70 or 80% of the stuff that we need to accomplish right out of the box. It'll give us the ability to blog. It'll give us the ability to create static pages. It'll give us the ability to have multiple users. It will have built-in RSS feeds. It'll have an easy way to integrate with the social web. And basically when you are trying to choose which one of these you should use, you basically need to write down all the requirements that your organization has. These are called user stories. So we need to have an administrator, we need to have an editor, we need to have contributors, we need to have subscribers, etc., etc. And you write down all of these things that you need to have, and then you look at these different open source content management systems, and you see kind of what their out-of-the-box capabilities are. And these are written right up on their websites. They tell you what they're good for and what capabilities they have. And then you say, okay, this is accomplishing about 75% of what I need to accomplish. And because they are open source, they have plug-in modules that extend their capability. And that is the joy of open source, is that since it's not proprietary, anybody can create something new for it. And the ethos of open source is that oftentimes when people create something new, a new bit of functionality called a plugin or a module, they'll contribute it back to the community. So say your organization needs a full width calendaring system. Somebody else at some other organization probably needed something very similar. They'll have created it and they'll have donated it back to the community. And more often than not, it will be free to download and install into your own content management system. So if you have Drupal and you're looking for something, it's probably going to be out there. And you can install it into your Drupal installation, and you'll have that functionality. Or another added benefit is that there's so many developers who are working on this type of thing that if you need extended functionality, it's generally easier to find somebody with experience with one of these content management systems than it would be with a proprietary content management system. I just want to flip through a couple of different websites. They're all Drupal, and I focus on Drupal just because it is a fantastic content management system, and also because we did this exercise with WordPress a little while ago. But the White House now uses Drupal to run its entire website. The data.gov.uk, which is the open governance website for England, is using Drupal. It's where people can come and access governmental data, download governmental data, and then use it and manipulate it in their own way. Tick 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 is a foundation nonprofit organization that's using Drupal, and they're focused on climate change. It's not just foundations and nonprofits and governmental agencies that are using Drupal, but Yahoo obviously could create their own proprietary solution, but Yahoo Style Guide is using Drupal. MTV UK is using Drupal, so even very large entertainment companies see the advantage of using an open source solution. And then Christina Aguilera, so pop star again from a large media company, they decided to implement her website in Drupal. And so the important thing is basically that, why would you use an open source solution? Well, content management systems and a lot of community Web 2.0 sites, social networking sites, they all basically start off with the same building blocks. And so the open source solution provides you again with that kind of 65-75% there of here are all the building blocks, and then you can build on top of it. So if you are paying attention to these websites, one of the things that needs to be changed on each one of them is the design. Well, if you don't have to build all that very low level stuff of, user needs to be able to log in, user needs to be able to write stuff, etc., you can start, putting your resources behind creating great design, etc. And so you've seen that each one of these sites is designed very differently, and then the developers who are creating it can then focus specifically on kind of the aspects and functionalities that make each one of these sites very different from each other. So, just wanted to focus on content management systems because we are content developers, but open source comes across the whole aspect of software. There's open source software for pretty much anything, And one of the kind of darlings in the activism space right now is Ushahidi, which is something that was created out of Kenya in order to do crisis mapping of their elections a couple of years ago, but is now being used across the world, most recently in a high-profile way in post-earthquake Haiti. And it allows people to update crises and submit information during crisis to a centralized location so that people can see what's going on where, and people can do it by logging into the website, by sending SMS messages, etc. The Google Android operating system, it's a mobile operating system, and I think that there will be some remarkable things coming out of that over the upcoming years in the NGO and activist space. Because it is an open system and people can use it and change it and manipulate it how they need to. There are major telephone companies, mobile companies that are behind Google Android right now and using it in their own phones. And basically the adoption rate of Android as an operating system is outpacing all others, and analysts think that Android will be the most prevalent operating system in the next couple of years, and the ability then to change it and hack it and use it for whatever specific function that you might need in whatever activity you're doing could be very important. OpenOffice is a desktop office productivity suite. It's basically the open source version of Microsoft Office, and a lot of governmental agencies around the world are now actually using this instead of Microsoft. And the reason is basically to have independence from a proprietary vendor and control over the types of files that are being created and the longevity of those files. One of the things that people are very worried about in governmental agencies and foundations and stuff is like, okay, it's 2010 now and we're creating digital documents. What's going to happen in 2050? Will a Microsoft still be making a Microsoft Word in 2050 that can open up the documents that we created in 2010 or 2000 or 1995? Projects like OpenOffice provide some sort of hope that you'll constantly be able to control the software so that you will have compatibility throughout the years. Firefox, of course, is a web browser that many of us are familiar with. It's open source. Thunderbird is also created by the Mozilla Foundation that creates Firefox. It's an email client. If your organization needs a wiki, you could download and install MediaWiki, which is the exact same thing that Wikipedia is created with. If you need image editing software, you could use GIMP. If you need audio editing software, you can use Audacity. And these are important, especially if you're doing, media training around the world. You're not going to start, spending hundreds of dollars per license for audio training in some part of the world. You can start off with an Audacity, which is a multi-track audio editor. It's great. You can accomplish great radio production quality work with it, and it's free and open source. And then the final thing I have down here is Sourceforge, and that is basically one of the aggregators and platforms that open source developers come to and collaborate with each other. There are many more out there, but just to give you a sense of the scope of what's happening in the open source world, they currently have 240,000 projects listed on the site. Many of them are obviously abandoned projects. They never took off and went anywhere, but many of them are fully mature and continue to be developed and are very important tools that we can all benefit from. The final thing that I want to focus on here is kind of a practical application in our current web environment, and even in our tablet and mobile environment, of the importance of open source. We're currently moving from HTML4, which we've been using over the past 10-15 years or so, into a new spec called HTML5, and that will be rolling out over the next couple of years. And part of HTML5 will be the difference in how media is displayed in the browser. And so that's in the browser on your computer and increasingly on our mobile devices. HTML5 will be doing a lot of other things as well, but just in terms of how it displays media and how it works with media is something that I want to focus on here, which is that, specifically on the video component of it, is that the different major browser operators, so Safari from Apple, Firefox from Mozilla, Chrome from Google, Internet Explorer from Microsoft, they're all kind of debating what type of video formats that they're going to be supporting. And and when I talk about video formats, I'm talking about these things called codecs, which is a way to compress video. Codecs stands for, it's a compression-decompression algorithm that's used so that when you create a video, you can compress it down to a small file size so that we can actually view it online. And so H.264 is something that is supported by Apple, and it's a wonderful codec. We use it all the time. Unfortunately, it's also copyrighted by and controlled by a group called MPEG-LA, and they've let the world use it for free over the past number of years. They don't have any licensing fees for using it, and so basically everybody supports it. So Adobe, which creates Flash, supports it, and that's important because Flash is what is predominantly used on the internet to display video. But one of the important things about HTML5 is that you won't need to use Flash anymore to display video. You'll just be able to stick up the file. And so, but MPEG-LA, which controls the copyright on the video codec H.264, has said, well, we'll keep it free until 2015, and then we'll decide what we're going to do in the future. And they might decide to keep it free moving forward in the future, or they might say, you know what, we're actually going to apply licensing fees to this. And those licensing fees could either be to the browser creators. It could be for software that you use to create videos, so Final Cut type of stuff, or iMovie for a Mac, or other types of video creation software that allows you to export in this format. Or they might keep it free, but nobody really knows. And on an alternative to H.264, and I should say that there are tons and tons of codecs, so this is just looking at two, but the alternative is VP8, which Google has released as an open source codec. They bought a company called On2 about a year ago, and On2 had this codec called VP8, and Google has taken it and they said, you know what? It is going to be open source and free for anybody to use. And so the crux of the matter here, and why this matters, is that the different major browser creators, so Microsoft, Apple, Google, Mozilla, they're all kind of wondering which of these codecs that they should support, and it will end up having a very significant economic consequence in the future if H.264 starts charging a license, and or if browsers and the manufacturers of these browsers decide that they will not support one or the other of these codecs. Most will probably support the open source one because there's no reason not to, but H.264 is also a very good one, And many people are creating H.264 video right now, primarily because that's what plays in an iPhone. So there's a 5-year window right now in terms of, am I going to create, as a content creator, am I going to create H.264 video, so that plays in an iPhone, but then might become a bit obsolete after 2015? Or will I start creating VP8 video, which I know that the majority of the browsers and the browsers that will be found on other non-Apple devices will be able to support. So this has been a look at open source and its background, some of the issues around it, its ethos, the legal frameworks around it, and kind of a little practical instance of things that we need to look forward moving into the future. And what I want to leave you with is something that I think is pretty amazing. It's a video created by an organization called the Blender Foundation. They have been creating 3D or open source 3D rendering software. And what I think is very important about this is that if you think about the types of movies that a Pixar and a DreamWorks have been making, and kind of the absolute, they're exquisite, the Wall-E's of the world, the Ratatouilles, etc. They're exquisite animations, and they have been outside the price points of independent animators over the course of the past 10-15 years of their creation. Well, the Blender Foundation has been creating free and open source 3D animation software, and last week, or a week and a half ago, they released their latest film that has been created with it. It's called Syntel, and I'm just going to play it for a few minutes just so you can see kind of the quality that they've been able to create, the production values using their open source software. All right, so you'll have to go to the Syntel.org website to see what actually happens. It's a 15-minute movie created with open source software, created both the animation software as well as the graphics were actually created in GIMP, which was mentioned before. So this has been an overview of open source software and why it is and will continue to be important.